The next tile that we need for our project is the quarter square triangle tile. To do this, we start out with 1.5 inch strips of fabric stitched together as we did before. But in this case, for this set, I've pressed the seam allowance towards the dark fabric. Once I have my sets, I simply cut the sets up into segments. So here it just helps if you line up the center seam with one of the lines on the shape cut ruler. And then I'm just cutting myself some 1.5 inch wide segments from this set. There we are. I have 5 segments of that one, and I'm going to cut myself 5 segments from this one here too. Here we have the segments ready to piece into 4 patches, and from the 4 patches I will then make my quarter square triangle tiles. I'm going to start stitching my 4 patches together using a thread saver to start off with, and a thread saver is simply a 3-inch square fabric folded in half, and I like to have that under my presser foot because then I can stitch from the thread saver straight onto what I'm sewing and clip it off as needed. I've got 2 segments of my mini mosaic for the quarter square triangle tile, and I'm going to line them up so that the seam lines butt up against each other, and you have one seam allowance going in one direction, one seam allowance going the other direction, and they actually lock into each other while you stitch. So I'm stitching from the thread saver straight onto the segments. When I'm done with that, I can just reach back here and clip off my thread saver. I'll leave it right there because I'll be needing it when I finish the seam as well. And I'm just going to carry on stitching my segments together, locking in the seam allowances as I go. Again, I'm using a 1/4 inch seam allowance here. And when I finish stitching all of my segments together, I simply slip the thread saver back in position and stitch back onto that. Clip my thread, and I've got all of my 4 patches finished. And I can simply clip them apart and they're ready to go. Now that I've finished with my 4 patches, I'm going to press the seam allowances for those open. Again, just to distribute the weight of the fabric as best I can. And here we have a lovely finished 4 patch ready to go. Once that 4 patch is ready, I use a 1.5 inch square of freezer paper, and just take your time with this because you do need to spend a few minutes just making sure that all 4 points of the freezer paper square line up with the seam lines of your 4 patch. Again, ironing it on, shiny side down onto the 4 patch, and then simply using my scissors, I cut along the edge of the freezer paper square then simply peel off the freezer paper to reveal my quarter square triangle tile ready to go into the project. The final tile we're going to need to show you how to do is the 1/2 and 1/4 square triangle tile. In order to do this, we simply piece together two 1.5 inch wide strips of fabric. In this case, I've pressed the seam allowance open, and then I cut the strips into 1.5 inch wide segments, which I'm going to stitch on to a 1.5 inch wide strip of fabric. Let me show you how. Now I'm starting to sew the segments onto the 1.5 inch strip of fabric, right sides together using a 1/4 inch seam. Cut my thread saver off. And you don't need to put them right up next to each other. Just stitch them close together onto the strip of fabric until you have all of your segments stitched on. Now I've got my segments on the strip. I simply cut them apart and press the seam allowances open on that unit. Once I've done that, I'm just going to take my freezer paper template and I'm going to line up 3 of the points of the square with the 3 seam lines on my fabric. Press it in place, and then I'm going to just cut along the edges of the freezer paper with my scissors. Peel off the freezer paper, and I've got my finished 1/2 and 1/4 square triangle tile ready to go into the Festival Mini Mosaic quilt block.